Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forward's talk on white supremacy and far-right extremism. Is the Capitol siege the end or the beginning? My name is Molly Boigon. I'm an investigative reporter at the Forward, and I cover conspiracy theories and disinformation. I'm thrilled to be joined by our panel guests. First, we have Joanna Mendelson, the executive director of the Center on Extremism at the Anti-Defamation League. Hi, Joanna.
Hello. Good to see you.
Next, we have Amy Spitalnick, executive director of Integrity First for America. Hi, Amy. And finally, we have Eric K. Ward, the Executive Director for the Western State Center and Senior Fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Hi, Eric.
Hello, it's great to be with you.
Great to have you all. So I'm going to ask all of the guests to introduce themselves in the chat while we wait for people to trickle into the Zoom. And for those of you who are joining us on Zoom, I'd ask you to drop any questions you may have, comments for the panelists in the Q&A section, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. So I think we'll wait a couple more minutes for people to trickle in. And in the meantime, it's exciting to see all the different people who are joining us from all over the country, all different fields of work. Very excited to have you all. It's going to be a great discussion. Somebody in the chat asked how the recording is going to be accessed later. Obviously you registered for the webinar, and so you'll be sent a link after the event with a recap and a video link to view a recording. All right, let's get started. So one of the things that we've all noticed in the aftermath of the Capitol siege and the news coverage is all of the different types of participants that we saw from the far right and extremist groups, including Proud Boys, neo-Nazis, QAnon adherents. Why do you think this event was so attractive to so many different types of groups? And what do you think was the shared message? Joanna, why don't you start us off?
Absolutely. I think what you have here is that across these movements, groups, and conspiracies, they all have different entry points, right? So their tactics, their subculture, their real world action may be very, very divergent. But where we see this commonality is in how they coalesce on the notion that they are fighting against the liberal forces that seek their demise, essentially, that threaten their existence. And so whether or not they personify it in this notion of like this global cabal, or the progressives and Democrats, feminists or liberals broadly, we see the concern that this element will force their existence. And there's a need to kind of fight against that. And so ultimately they're peddling in disinformation. We're seeing them embrace fear tactics. And at the end of the day, they perceive Donald Trump as the embodiment of their savior, basically the warrior who's going to help protect their future and their values.
You know, you touched on this fear element, and that's also something that we saw in the preceding the attack and in the aftermath. A lot of imagery about the apocalypse, the end of times, the end of Western white Christian society as we know it. Eric, can you talk about why that type of messaging was cropping up and continues to crop up in these spaces?
Absolutely. We begin to see a narrative of conspiracy that has been shaped actually over several decades. It's just that the narrative right now has lifted up, right? The level of the noise has grown to a level that the rest of us in America are now becoming aware of this narrative. We should be clear, the events of January 6th were largely driven by conspiracy that somehow the election was stolen from Donald Trump. And as Joanna said, I think so eloquently, there was a diverse number of political tendencies that were on the Capitol grounds and inside the Capitol building. And what brought them together was a belief that the United States of America and its system of democracy should be overthrown, and that an authoritarian leader should be put into its place. The narratives and the conspiracies that drove that are threefold. The first is accelerationist, right? The idea that somehow white people in the United States as a demographic are being engaged, right, are victims of a genocide, a plan to remove them by replacing their minority, right, making them a minority, and then replacing that population with people of color. The second is QAnon, the conspiracy that tells the story of Donald Trump as a superhero who is leading a war against an international secret cabal of political, economic, and cultural leaders who are engaging in assaults and harassment of young children, particularly the charges of sexual abuse. The third, right, is a direct, blatant anti-Semitic conspiracy. The idea that Jews since the 1960s have been leading a conspiracy, right, to destroy the white race by empowering civil rights and democracy in this country. All three of those narratives, whether the subtle end of a stolen election or the hardcore narrative of anti-Semitism, have created a story for nearly a third of Republicans who believe that somehow they are in an existential war, right, with a global elite. I liken it to the X-Files. It works because it's a exciting narrative that places one in this ultimate battle between good and evil. But the truth is that the narratives are false, but the outcome is very real. 140 law enforcement officers who were injured, over 5 people killed on January 6th. And that was just the culmination of over 3 decades of organizing that have taken the lives of hundreds of Americans.
Amy, you've also taken the long view on this, obviously working closely on the Charlottesville case. How do you see those related and fitting into this sort of legacy of, this narrative about the ultimate battle, false claims driving people toward this fear that generated the attack on the Capitol?
That's exactly right. And that this is the inevitable result of years of disinformation, of hate, of conspiracies that have gone on unfettered on social media, fueled by those at the highest levels of our government, with very little accountability and justice. And so anyone who was surprised on January 6th simply hasn't been paying attention, has been our message. And I think everyone here, if you're watching this event, you probably weren't surprised. You probably have been following it. But there are many who were seemingly blindsided by what happened. And I think simply they haven't been following the broader rise of violent extremism in this country over the last few years. And we know this both anecdotally from Charlottesville to Pittsburgh to Poway to El Paso and the many other acts of violence and hate in between. But we also know this from the stats. We know that 2019 was the deadliest year on record for hate crimes, that just a couple months ago, the Department of Homeland Security named white supremacy the most pervasive and lethal threat to this country. Joanna can probably share many of the ADL's fantastic stats, which are quite alarming. But we know that anti-Semitic incidents hit an all-time high since the ADL had been tracking in 2019, and far-right extremists were responsible for the vast majority of far-right extremist murders domestically. And I'm sure that there are an infinite amount of stats beyond that, that the ADL and others have that affirm what we all know. This is a crisis. And so anyone who is surprised hasn't been paying attention. But also there are direct through lines from these attacks. We see how each has been used to both inspire the next one and also to fuel the broader cycle of recruitment. So my organization, Integrity First for America, is suing the 24 leaders and hate groups responsible for the violence in Charlottesville. And there are a number of parallels that we've seen from the Charlottesville attack to the Capitol, and of course, some differences as well that I'm sure that we'll get into. But we also know that there's a direct line that runs from Charlottesville through these other attacks to January 6th. The fact that the Pittsburgh shooter communicated with some of the Charlottesville leaders before his attack. The Christchurch shooter in New Zealand 2 years ago donated to some of our Charlottesville defendants and painted onto his gun a white power symbol popularized by another defendant. Christchurch was live streamed and in turn inspired Poway in El Paso. And even now, just a few days ago, there were reports on how extremists, not just domestically, but globally, are using the Capitol attack to recruit and to also seemingly inspire other attacks. And so it's really important to understand that through line, the ways in which attacks are used to inspire the next one, and the ways in which they're not just used as examples, but also as recruitment tools to continue broadening and spreading this violent hate.
Yeah, I'd like to talk more about the issue of recruitment, because you do see in the news reports some instances of QAnon adherents disavowing the movement after, there was supposed to be this sort of momentous moment of turnover that never happened. And then we also all saw that members of the Proud Boys, were sort of turning on each other. But then again, it's true that the imagery is going to be used not only as a recruitment tool, but also as propaganda by our foreign enemies. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the, some of the recruitment avenues that these images, videos, sort of manifestos might go down. Joanna, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think, what Amy brought about is the weaponization of technology. And I think that is such a powerful element in the current landscape that we have operating today. The ability to use technology, whether to live stream these murderous attacks in Christchurch or Hull, as Amy noted, to seed that hateful footage across the internet. Essentially 1.5 million downloads took place 24 hours after Christchurch. The learning curve, the indoctrination, the ability to spread this in kind of this virtual loudspeaker is phenomenal and in some ways frightening. The ability to harness memes and images, to inject satire and bigoted humor, to almost desensitize the viewers, to make it more palatable, less offensive. So whether or not they're, peddling Holocaust imagery and embracing Adolf Hitler in the vein of this is only a joke, or whether or not they're investing in more high-tech ways to indoctrinate and to educate, using drone footage to educate and to push messages out there, using encrypted chats and platforms to communicate, using live streaming in order to reach a global audience. And we saw evidence of that on January 6th at the Capitol, where the technology was used to augment the actions, their ability to communicate, to engage, and to mobilize. And so we are seeing technology being used in this way to help in the virtual space indoctrinate, to recruit, and to radicalize. And some of it is nefarious and targeted, and some is happenstance, right? So my kids can go on TikTok and be exposed to messages of hate, of embracing domestic terrorism and Holocaust denial. And the accessibility of some of that is something that is quite notable. You can fall down the rabbit hole very easily in a basic, when you access online spaces. And this is one of the problems that we have to address.
Absolutely. We have a couple of questions in the chat that I think are relevant to this. Joanna, talking about the ease with which people can kind of fall down the rabbit hole. Stephen Lesnick is asking about, we did see violent extremists at the Capitol. We also saw pretty well mainstream Republicans who believed claims that they had heard online, claims that they had heard from the president. And, I think that that's really important to note. How do those circles kind of overlap? And what is the path forward when, when it's not just the far right wing of, of the country, but some people sort of unwittingly participating in this type of movement?
So I think what we have, and we've always cautioned against, is the ability for the fringe and their rhetoric to influence the mainstream. And we have seen evidence of that for years, right? This most extreme ideology and core tenets that then get articulated by our politicians and by our leaders. And so what happens in the virtual space is it elevates the fringe beliefs. It puts them on an even playing field with others because of the accessibility. And if we have platforms that don't crack down on disinformation and hate, then the ability for it to proliferate is something quite notable. And so there's large efforts that we need to engage in order to essentially do a virtual hygiene cleansing, right? Make our platforms more responsible, help to flag and be transparent in how we identify misinformation, making it harder to access those messages and not create the sense of community. When you see it repeated over and over and over again, in some ways, there is a broken record effect that desensitizes you to the possibility of that disinformation. And we saw, as January 6th played out, people who felt duped, they felt misguided, people who perhaps hadn't drank the Kool-Aid necessarily, or maybe they drank the Kool-Aid, but they necessarily, the way that they arrived on it was based in ignorance. And so we saw this fallout right now. And I think that helping to not elevate that disinformation voice is something very, very critical in this larger conversation of addressing extremism online.
Amy, why don't you weigh in on that, the issue of, accountability for the platforms? What has changed? Obviously there's been a movement to, hold many platforms, but Facebook in particular, accountable. And, what are you seeing? Is there more of a sense of urgency now? Is the messaging changed? Talk a little bit about what's changed and what hasn't.
Yeah. Well, I think it's always important to start this conversation on the role of platforms by making clear that no social media site is obligated to give a platform to hate, to violence, to extremism. That is at odds with everything that the Communications Decency Act and that their own rules in terms of service are meant to protect against. There's a lot of debate around this question of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I'm sure many here have heard this term floating around in the media over the last few years, and it's become a bit of a political tool, a political cudgel, if you will. But what Section 230 was originally supposed to do was actually give social media and internet platforms, really internet platforms, it was before social media when it was created, the ability to regulate content on their site without having to face liability. And it's of course also created a circumstance in which these social media sites can allow hate speech and other forms of extremism on their site without liability. But no social media platform is obligated to give a platform to that sort of hate. And we know firsthand that it works when they deplatform extremism. And you don't have to take it from me. For example, one of the key defendants in our Charlottesville lawsuit, Richard Spencer, who I'm sure many of you know, a very prominent neo-Nazi, was deplatformed from a number of sites after Charlottesville. And he said in court just a few months ago that our lawsuit has been financially crippling, which was of course heartening for us to hear, and that he hasn't been able to raise money and go about his business because he's been deplatformed from a number of social media and fundraising sites. And so we know that it works. And of course, many of us have seen sort of how the deplatforming of even Trump has had positive impacts on the spread of disinformation and misinformation over the last few weeks. And so we know that it works. We know that no social media platform is obligated to give space to this sort of hate. It's a matter of making sure that they live up to their responsibilities here. And the world has changed so dramatically in the last few years. We see firsthand how social media has been exploited and used by these extremists, not just to spread hate, but to actively plan violence. We know, for example, in our Charlottesville case, the primary evidence are social media chats from a site called Discord, where the violence was planned in meticulous detail for months in advance. And so there needs to be a recognition by these sites and by, I think, the consumers who use these sites, that social media in many ways has become sort of the clan den of the 21st century, the place where these extremists come together to plan and to organize violence. And it's only then that we can start to address this proliferation of extremism. And for sites that have built business models on allowing extremism to thrive, we also need to engage the web hosting and domain registration companies that can actively shut those sites down if the sites themselves won't act.
I think you raise a lot of interesting points about what appears to be a lack of intervention despite planning the attack sort of in plain sight on some of these sites that were also used to plan Charlottesville. And that raised questions for a lot of people, along with some of the videos and images that we saw of law enforcement officers either failing to stop the siege, or in some cases, we've heard reports of people being offered directions. I'm wondering, Eric, if you might address what we've learned and what questions we still have about the role of law enforcement, in some cases aiding the siege, in some cases simply not stopping it, in other cases former law enforcement and military individuals participating in the siege. Why does this middle part of the Venn diagram exist?
Yeah. I think this is where we really get down to it. If we are asking ourselves, how did this happen? We have to be brave enough to start by picking up the mirror and taking a look at it. Right? The white nationalist movement in America and this alt-right coalition that it's built did not appear out of thin air. And I don't believe, and we don't believe at Western State Center, nor at Southern Poverty Law Center, that it is useful to frame these groups or movements as extremist or fringe. Nearly 1 in 5 Americans currently believes in some aspect, right, of the QAnon conspiracy in this country, and believes that Donald Trump rightfully won the elections, right, despite all the actual factual evidence to the contrary. So we can't think of it as a fringe movement. This is part of a mainstream phenomena. And it's a mainstream phenomena because social movements don't bring bigotry into our communities. I say this often. They simply organize the bigotry that already exists. If we want to understand, we first have to acknowledge our own shortfalls within civil society. For nearly 5 years now, we have watched law enforcement engage in biased policing of the Black Lives Matters movement in this country. It has been documented not only by human rights organizations, right, but by journalists and by city audits, including right here in Portland, Oregon. There was a disproportionate type of policing that occurred. And when that occurred without response, it signaled to many of these alt-right organizations that there was room upon which to organize. And when they began to organize, and let's remember, it didn't start with the siege on the Capitol. It started on the streets and the rural roads of America, in places like Portland, Oakland, Wisconsin, and Brooklyn, New York. As this was happening, we witnessed alt-right activists appearing in these cities with weapons and participating in what appeared to be paramilitary style tactics. Often law enforcement turned their backs to this and ignored it, despite the level of concern. It is not surprising then to see the high level of law enforcement engagement, right? In the city of Seattle, Washington, at least a dozen law enforcement officers participated in this insurrection in DC, report after report. Again, if you were surprised by that information, it is because you have chosen not to acknowledge it. I am not the first person to say this. So we have seen bias policing that helped feed into this moment, but it's not just bias policing. It's also our own attitudes. And I reflect on a story from about 4 years ago, an alt-right rally here in Portland, Oregon, where a young alt-right activist was being harangued by someone with a camera who was demanding that this alt-right activist explain why he was in Portland because no one wanted him in Portland. And this alt-right activist said something that all of us should hold. What he said was this: yes, I've heard that we're not wanted here, but the truth of the matter is that the city of Portland is losing its Black population by both percentage and whole number. He then said to the person, you can say you don't want us here, but the truth is you're doing something we could never get away with. You are shrinking and disappearing the Black population. The truth of the matter is that the white nationalist movement is growing because we have not made real the promises of equity in our society. In our refusal to deal with segregation in housing, in education, in employment, right, signals to this white nationalist movement that they have more room than they actually do. If we really want to counter the white nationalist movement and the alt-right, we have to make real on the promises of equity in the society. It leaves us vulnerable as police bias.
I think you're hitting on some really important points that also, people have been asking in the chat about, because we have, a significant share of people in this country that buy into one conspiracy theory or another. What is the solution? Which I want to circle back to, because we've also gotten some questions about the far left and whether there is a sort of unbalanced focus on far right extremism when people see anti-Semitism and other issues on the left. So I would like to address that. Let's start with Amy.
Well, I think to start, there is no equivalency between far right extremism in this country and far left extremism. That isn't to say that there isn't extremism on the left. There, of course, there is. There's anti-Semitism on the left. There's racism on the left. There's a whole variety of problems that exist on the left. But the gravest threat to our country right now is this threat of far right extremism that is manifesting in all the ways we've been talking about here. The people who are walking into synagogues, killing congregants as they're praying on Shabbat. The people who are attacking counter-protesters in our streets in Charlottesville and Portland and a variety of other places over the last few years. And the people who were responsible for an insurrection at the seat of our government just a few weeks ago are coming from the right. And we're also seeing this, to sort of build on the point Eric was making, and Joanna made earlier as well, how it's being mainstreamed on the right. These are not just fringe extremists anymore. Just yesterday, half the GOP caucus gave a standing ovation to Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has repeated lie and conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory that is rooted in anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, racist hate, and fundamental conspiracies related to 9/11 and school shootings. And for half of the GOP caucus to give a standing ovation to someone who has spewed such hate and lies and bigotry really is a perfect illustration of how this sort of extremism is being mainstreamed in our politics right now. And for us to begin to address extremism, we need to first not create false equivalencies, because that doesn't allow us to actually recognize the threat and the problem that we're grappling with now. We're going to sort of start trying to both sides this. We're going to sort of both sides this issue to death. And we need to also recognize that these aren't just fringe extremists, but very real players who are part of the mainstream of the right now. And again, this isn't to say that there isn't anti-Semitism, other forms of extremism on the left, but we can't create an equivalency there. It's so important that we recognize where the threat is. Every stat backs this up, from the ones from the ADL to the FBI's own hate crime stats to our Department of Homeland Security and intelligence agencies, who have affirmed that the greatest threat right now is white supremacist and other far-right domestic extremism. And so until we acknowledge that, until we stop trying to both sides this issue, we are never going to be able to break this cycle.
Joanna, anything to add on that? I know the ADL has tracked this issue.
Yeah, and I think that was really well kind of summarized in terms of the larger landscape, the challenges and the problem of both siding it. And I think if you look at the ADL stats, we understand that data drives policy, right? That gives us not just the anecdote, not just the sentiment, but hardcore evidence that identifies where the threats in our nation are coming from. Whether or not it's in our heat map for hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, and terrorism that documents 7 different data sets around the country by geography, by themes, by ideology, or within the report that we just authored and released yesterday on murder and extremism in 2020. And what we found is that what we saw in 2020 reflects what we've seen in the last decade. That in 2020, 94% of all domestic extremist related murders, looking across the continuum, including left, were perpetrated by right-wing extremists. And more than half of that had ties to white supremacists. And the similar vein, the year before in 2019, we saw 90% of all domestic extremist related murders were linked to right-wing extremists. And this dovetails perfectly with this last decade, that we saw 75% of all of these murders by ideologically motivated extremists come from the right and come from specifically white supremacists. So whether or not it's the recent DHS report that just got released that highlighted kind of the general concerns that we have facing our nation, the desire to target here in America, the desire to target the infrastructure, whether or not it's the power lines or the water or even the supermarket. We're very pleased, specifically from ADL's vantage point, that there is a focus because this deserves attention. We need to elevate this threat. We need to have eyes wide open, understanding the data points, and the real world action that is precipitated by those who translate this ideological extremism into real world action. Just this past December, for example, there was a 17-year-old Ohio teenager who was allegedly involved in a plot that said lights out, motivated by right-wing extremism. And according to the plot, he allegedly wanted to target power lines this coming summer. And so the threat by individuals like him or by accelerationists, which Eric articulated before, who basically perceive in the accelerationist form, they perceive the Jews as injecting these deviant values into the system and helping to spiral our system down into chaos. And any way that they can expedite and target our system is looked at as a win to kick off this chaos and ultimately a race war. So we see this not only from a most extreme strain of white supremacy, but across the board when it comes to right-wing extremism. And there needs to be significant attention paid to the threat that we see here in America.
Yes, and I think that that's a good way to circle back to the point that Eric was making, that so many of these ideologies are more widespread than I think a lot of Americans care to admit. And a bunch of questions in the chat about this. What is the path forward when it seems like Americans in some cases can't even agree on basic fact? Eric, why don't you start?
Americans don't have to agree on basic fact. We do have to agree, though, that there is basic law in this country. And one of the highest aspirational aspects of that law is that everyone has the right to live, love, worship, and work free from fear and bigotry. That is the moral line in America. That is what it means to live an inclusive democracy that is people-centered, transparent, and accountable. We have to understand, right, that those who choose to cross that line need to be held accountable. But to hold them accountable, we have to stop making excuses, right? This white nationalist alt-right movement, these conspiracies are not driven by economic alienation, right? There was a study in Atlantic magazine out of Chicago that just pointed to this, but it is not the first study, right? James Aho in the 1980s, in his own study in Idaho of the white nationalist movement, found that the white nationalist movement had a higher level of education than the general population of Idaho, had a higher level of income than the general population of Idaho. We buy into our own myths about these movements at our own risk. The truth is that these movements are disproportionately, right, middle and upper class, disproportionately highly educated. This is an ideology and a worldview. If economics play a role, they play a role by providing permission. I remember September 11th, and I remember by the time I got from my home to my office in Seattle, right, 2 hate crimes had already occurred. In one case, someone had stuffed a stick of dynamite under a gas line in a Jewish house of worship in Tacoma. In the other, someone had hung a banner from an overpass saying "Death to the Palestinians." Those were the first 2, right? And I used to ask people, is it that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia just suddenly appeared out of nowhere because of the September 11th attacks? Or was it that folks suddenly felt permission, right, to kind of act in anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bigotry that they already held? In the same way, right, if the white nationalist movement and the alt-right looks robust in our society, it's because they feel permission, right? And we are the only folks who can remove that permission. And I think we do it in 2 ways. The first is that we have to start demanding that our judicial and law enforcement institutions do their job. And if they can't do their job, they need to resign their positions. It is that clear. Whether democracy exists or not is not a curious conversation. It is a non-negotiable. And we are seeing way too many law enforcement officers, judges, and prosecutors who are more beholden to their political ideology than the rule of law. And it is time for us to point that out and to say so. The second is to understand that research is wonderful. We do lots of important research at Southern Poverty Law Center. We do it at the Anti-Defamation League. We do it at other organizations as well. But we need to move from research of the problem to engagement. And engagement means engaging with communities. This is not going to be a discussion that gets solved in DC or Portland or Los Angeles. It has to be solved in the 10,000 communities that exist around the country. I was very excited to see the Secretary of Defense yesterday order a stand down from the division to unit level, right? And a stand down means this, that every unit in our armed forces over the next 30, 60 days will be having direct conversations around white nationalism and its impact. They will be reviewing laws and regulations. We need this kind of stand down across America, and we need municipal governments to stand up. But that conversation, and I'll just say this last piece, can't just be the elites in our community. I liken it to high school. You don't help educate students by simply focusing on the student council, right? The most highly networked, successful folks probably on a high school campus. You have to reach into other communities, into NASCAR, into the arts, into working communities who are the targets of white nationalist organizing. We have to take this seriously. We need to hold our institutions accountable, as I said, and we need to begin to campaign in communities in authentic ways. not to manipulate people, but for them to understand that the threat of white nationalism isn't merely a threat to people of color and Jews. It is a threat to democracy.
And I think the issue of accountability from that perspective, and also, kind of circling back to an approach that Amy's taken, in the legal sphere, is important to examine after the Capitol attack. Amy, how do you think the government is doing tracking down some of the insurrectionists, and what are some next steps for people who are interested in that legal accountability lane?
Well, I think in general, the last 4 years, and frankly, longer than that, but particularly the last 4 years, have put a fine point on the stunning lack of accountability and justice that there has been for these extremists. And that's true both of Charlottesville and a variety of other instances, including, and I think especially, some of the events that might not have gotten as much attention as the larger scale attacks, but the sorts of violence that we saw in communities like Portland and in the Pacific Northwest and around the country, where activists are so often targeted by extremists. And again, there's a stunning lack of accountability, or of course, the disparate accountability. There was a really fascinating story in the Washington Post the other day about how in Florida, Black Lives Matter protesters were attacked by Proud Boys, and it was only the BLM protesters who faced any sort of legal recourse. And so at IFA, our lawsuit is frankly one of the only means of seeking accountability for the extremists responsible for what happened in Charlottesville 3.5 years ago. There were a handful of individual prosecutions. In a different era, Charlottesville might not have happened, but if it did, there might have also been a Department of Justice that would have gone after the broader conspiracy responsible. In lieu of that, we've brought our case, which takes on the broader leadership of this movement, who were directly responsible for orchestrating the violence. And it's specifically a case that takes on the conspiracy of what happened. It's a conspiracy case using a fascinating statute called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. Since the Capitol, there has been much more accountability than there's been in a variety of other instances, but I think there's still so much more that needs to be done. We've seen individual prosecutions. We saw some initial conspiracy cases being brought over the last week or so against some of the insurrectionists. And there's been reports that the Department of Justice is considering pursuing a RICO case, which is a criminal conspiracy case typically used against gang members and mafia members, against a number of the insurrectionists. And that is great. We think that if we, as a small nonprofit, can take on the leaders of this movement through our civil litigation, and financially cripple them, as Richard Spencer has said, imagine what the Department of Justice, using the tools it currently has, could do civilly and criminally in this space. There is so much within the current powers of our federal government that can be done to have the sort of accountability and justice that has been so sorely lacking over the last few years. And the Capitol violence is truly sort of the perfect place to begin for them. And so that we hope that our case provides a model and frankly validation that this strategy works. We're not the first to use civil litigation against far-right extremist groups. The SPLC and other groups did this in the 80s and 90s successfully. We're building on that strategy with our case. And we think that particularly right now, with the Department of Justice and an administration that has signaled the importance of taking on white supremacy and extremism, there is an opportunity to really use the tools and the powers of our government to effectively, civilly and criminally take on these extremists however possible, within the current constraints of what they can do.
Another aspect of this accountability question that comes up a lot and is coming up in the Q&A right now is deplatforming, which we touched on a little bit. People are asking about the sort of flip side of deplatforming, which we're familiar with and which I wrote about for the forward after the Capitol insurrection, because we saw notorious white nationalists like Baked Alaska live streaming the Capitol siege on DLive, even though it had been kicked off of other platforms. Joanna, I'm wondering if you can address the issue of siloing and concerns about further radicalization in these sort of non-mainstream fringier platforms like Gab, Parler, and the like.
So I think we talked about the general goal of helping to make our platforms more responsible. They do not have an obligation to lift up every voice, and as private entities, they can decide what type of information can exist on their platforms. In fact, ADL has worked with our Center on Technology and CTS, Center on Technology and Society, to help work on terms of service and not only have them and establish them for tech companies, but put teeth to them. And so while it's beneficial to have these voices decentralized, to make it harder to access this information, what we are also seeing is the fact that they are now being forced into these echo chambers. Whereas before there may have been countering narratives that would challenge the messages that were put forth. Now they are surrounded by like-minded extremists, like-minded ideals. And even we may have seen this more mainstream conservatism, this more right of censure, going onto spaces that are known to be lions' dens for hate and for extremism. And the possibility for them to coalesce and to expand their base is something notable. We're actually seeing them articulate a strategy. Let's meet these new additions to our platforms by talking about the key issues that will resonate with them, whether or not it's COVID lockdown, whether or not it's immigration, or the election of President Biden. And so these are ways in which they can help bridge some of those gaps. And then also you have the element of a whack-a-mole game. How is this sustainable, right? As we deplatform, all of these different places like Wimkin and Parler, DLive kicked off numerous people. As they do that, how is this not going to be a game of whack-a-mole? And we see them time and time again retool and reemerge in a new space. So we need a broader solution. But I also want to add the fact that although these tech companies have taken efforts to exercise their terms of service, to create these anti-hate policies, anti-Holocaust denial policies, not just as disinformation, but as forms of hate speech, we find an overall lack of transparency. They are not sharing their data in a transparent mechanism for us to understand and to analyze the impact. So truth be told, we just don't know. And I think the perfect illustration of this is something that ADL just launched our scorecard, a report card for Holocaust denial. Now we looked at a number of platforms that articulated anti-Holocaust denial policies and enforcement. But unfortunately, we measured how fast they were to remove the hateful content tracked by non-ADL accounts and flagged for the company. And an overwhelming number of the platforms that we saw got a D rating. They got a D rating because of their inability to either remove it, the ages that it took to get something taken off their platform. This was on Facebook, Instagram, Discord, Reddit, Steam, amongst many others. And so there is a lot of work to be done. We can't just say the policies and kind of spread goodwill. We actually have to see it having real impacts.
Is there anything that, Eric, I'll start with you. Is there anything that you're seeing coming up legislatively? We talked a little bit about Section 230 and other manners of holding tech companies accountable. Anything you're seeing coming up this year, or any new sense of urgency, even from the new presidential administration, or anything on the state or local level?
Yes, I think we will see, we are seeing and will continue to see significant legislation come forward, and also rules and regulations that are being reviewed. And this is a good time for all of us, right, to be in close contact with state legislators and our congressional representatives, right, and letting the White House's individuals know what we think about issues. What I worry about is that in this level of fear, that we could overreach, right? And we have to be cautious in this moment. We are hearing conversations around domestic terrorism. I won't weigh into that in this amount of time, but what I will say is we have to be cautious about giving more power, right, to law enforcement institutions that have been unwilling, right, to address the white nationalism in their ranks, right, for not just a few years, but for decades, despite repeated warnings from US intelligence agencies, from the Department of Homeland Security, and from organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and Southern Poverty Law Center. We have to be cautious that as we do this, we are not causing more harm, but we will see legislation around national security, around the debate around domestic terrorism that all of us should be weighing into. In terms of online platforms, yes, it's time for us to prepare to rein in social media platforms. And I'm saddened by that. I'm saddened that these platforms chose profit, right, over their duties, right, to serve the public globally. And you do not serve the public globally, right, by putting profits at a point where you are opening spaces that have become conducive, right, to inspiring people to engage in acts of mass violence. That is an overreach by business that needs to be reined in. But we have to be cautious even there. We have to think about the unintended consequences. One of the unintended consequences of deplatforming could be that we help to drive people into smaller silos where there is no chance for intervention, there is no chance for monitoring. It's also possible that by removing people from social media platforms, that there could be a correlation to an increased street presence as they try to find new ways to gather and to engage. That does not mean we should not engage in continuing the work of deplatforming. Organizations like the ADL, Color of Change, Muslim Advocates, and Southern Poverty Law Center, who have done that work, have served the public well. But it's time for us to understand that the conversation in addressing white nationalism, the alt-right, needs to expand in a deep conversation around potential unintended consequences. We can't lose our democracy as we attempt to try to manage this problem.
I think that relates to a question that we got a couple times in the chat about, you talked about law enforcement not addressing white nationalism within its ranks. And, lots of people in the chat and in the world have questions about how, the government can be expected to sort of clamp down on this movement while simultaneously weeding out issues within it. I'm wondering, Amy, if you can talk about that challenge and what is next for people who are wondering about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think really to echo what Eric was saying, I think there is so much that we can do within the current tools the federal and state and local governments have. And my background before IFA was I worked in the state attorney general's office in New York. And in 2016, when we saw a horrific rise in hate crimes after the election, we put out a bulletin to law enforcement, to local law enforcement around the state that made clear that they had an obligation under New York law to effectively and aggressively take on hate crimes. And that's true of local governments, state governments, and the federal government. And so I think we're coming into this conversation right now, and there's sort of an impetus and an inclination to sort of overshoot what we need. We need everything right now. Because we're coming into this after 4 years of a federal government that actively disinvested from fighting hate. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, their cases were down nearly 2/3 compared to the end of the Obama administration. We know that funding was stripped from a variety of different programs on this front, putting aside the fact that there was efforts by political appointees to bury the threat of white supremacy, and of course the ways in which the president and many others threw fuel on the fire. And so I wholeheartedly agree with what Eric said, that we need to sort of step back and assess where we're at, using the tools we have to immediately both assess that threat and hold accountable those responsible. But we should be careful that there is the potential for some of these potential measures to put at risk many of our values and many of our civil liberties. And so there will be a discussion at some point, I'm sure, on a domestic terror statute. There are very real risks there related to people's civil liberties and to the ways in which it could be abused to go after groups like Black Lives Matter. We need to have that conversation. That doesn't mean that we also put a pause on everything the government can do right now with all the tools in its toolbox. And so coming at it from so far sort of like below zero where the federal government was for the last 4 years, there is that inclination to maybe overreach. And I think we need to actually assess where we're at. Just 2 weeks ago, Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, announced a few initial measures that will do just that, using the tools the federal government has, conducting a comprehensive assessment through the intelligence agencies and a variety of other government institutions to understand this threat, to begin to address it in a way that it hasn't over the last few years. And I believe just yesterday, the Senate passed a resolution to that same effect. And of course, as Joanna mentioned, or maybe she mentioned earlier before this panel, there's a hearing going on today in the House looking at this issue. And so there's so much, again, that can be done right now to assess the threat and to begin to fight for accountability without that overreach that has the potential to raise some concerning and dangerous issues. The last thing I'll just add here is that, and I see some conversation in the chat on the question of free speech and civil liberties. We think our case in particular is a good model for how you go after these extremists in a way that doesn't violate speech, that doesn't violate the First Amendment. And we've been heartened to have the support of folks like the former president of the ACLU and a number of ACLU leaders in our case saying as much, that our case is an important path to take on extremism without infringing on free speech, the same way that the judge in our case said as much during his, in his opinion, rejecting the defendant's motions to dismiss. And so there are ways to take on extremism without treading on the rights that are central to our democracy. We can use them, and we can continue to assess what else is necessary to truly address this threat. But that doesn't mean that we immediately go from 0 to 60 right now when there are so many tools already in the toolbox.
I think now is a great time to turn to our final question. It's obviously a very dark subject matter. It's personal to many people. So we'll try and end on an uplifting note. I'm wondering what coming up this year you're looking forward to in this space, or something that gives you hope. Joanna, why don't you start?
Sure. Amy alluded to it. What's taking place, it's very timely for today's conversation. Our CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt, is currently testifying on Capitol Hill to help launch our initiative called Protect. And essentially, Protect is this framework for a comprehensive 7-part plan to mitigate the threat posed by not only domestic extremists, but terrorists as well. And as both of our panelists have said, it's that fine balance between helping to address the concerns and the threats, but making sure that we are thoughtful with the civil rights and civil liberties that are so precious and that we need to continue to protect. So within Protect, this acronym, and I'll include the link in the chat, essentially it's a 7-part step that is a wraparound service. There's no single solution to address this. You can't legislate our way through this. We can't address it with only one prong. And so instead, we must look at educating, working with tech companies, encouraging our leadership to use their bully pulpits to create guardrails and not allow hate to fester and grow, because that silence essentially emboldens extremists. And so looking at the 7-part step, it's how do we bring all the tools and all the wraparound services of our community in order to address it. And to leave it on a positive side, my team and I are dedicated to looking at the underbelly of America. We are looking in everywhere from encrypted chats to the dark web, and looking at the kind of the muck of our country. And yet we must keep in mind that this is a fringe. This doesn't represent the American value system. And this is not, this does not represent us as a whole. And so we must understand this as fringe, speak out, and continue to be relentless to spotlight the hate that exists and persists. And so thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. Eric, your turn. What gives you hope?
Yeah, what gives me hope is that, for one, I don't think anyone is ever going to accuse me of hyperbole again in terms of the threat of white nationalism. And I'm sorry that it took this to get to that point, but I'm glad that we are at this point. And what really gives me hope is folks understand, right? Even everyone listening here, that we are not in this dilemma because we are losing, right? We are in this dilemma because we have moved our country, as John Lewis has said, from the aspirational idea of democracy to actual democracy. We're not perfect. We still have a long way to go, but what we are facing is a backlash. And that backlash lost on January 6th. And all of us should remember that. And it not only lost on January 6th, but it lost in November. We should keep remembering, right, that this backlash can be managed. And what gives me hope is that there are now hundreds of thousands of Americans, not just activists like me, but lawyers, elected officials, business leaders, faith leaders, young people who understand that by coming together, bringing our communities together, that we can successfully manage this white nationalist threat so that we can get to the real work of our communities. White nationalism just seeks to separate us. It wants to divide us so that we cannot deal effectively with COVID or unemployment or the host of other issues in our community. We're not going to be divided. We're not the losers here. And I guess what gives me the most hope is that we get to act like the winners we are. We get to join a 21st century civil rights movement. That gives me lots of hope.
Thanks, Eric. Amy?
I think I of course wholeheartedly agree with Joanna and Eric, as I almost always do. And for me, I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And certainly over the last few years, I've thought a lot more about my family's history than perhaps I did in the many years beforehand, because it's so easy to feel hopeless and scared and angry in this moment and draw parallels between our history as a Jewish people and the darkest times in that history to where we are right now. And some of those parallels are very fair. It's fair to be frightened. It's fair to feel scared and helpless and hopeless. But there's a big difference. We live in a country where there is a rule of law and a justice system, and we can use them to hold these extremists accountable and bring them to justice. And so what gives me hope this year is that we are quite literally putting the leaders of this extremist movement on trial in Charlottesville on October 25th. We just got our official court date yesterday. And using our justice system, which we've had to fight like crazy to protect over the last few years, using that rule of law to make sure these extremists are held accountable, provides a very concrete and tangible way that we could fight back at a moment where it's so easy to feel like there is not a lot the average person can do. And to that point, the fact that hundreds of people turned out in the middle of the workday for a conversation like this to learn about how we can actually do something builds on that hope for me. And so if you want to specifically get involved in our case and sign up for case updates, you can do so at our website, which I'll put in chat, and get involved in holding these extremists accountable through our justice system. But it's also going to take that comprehensive approach that we've been talking about today. Our case is just one tool in the toolbox that will also involve so many of the other elements, from NGOs like the ADL and Western States Center to government action on all levels, to making sure social media companies and tech companies do the right thing, and so much more. Fighting extremism doesn't just mean fighting extremism specifically, but the broader societal issues that Eric and others have touched on here. And so that all gives me hope. We are at a place where we can actually move forward and take concrete, tangible action. For me, that will be in October on trial in Charlottesville. But I know that that will just be one piece of a much larger puzzle that my fellow panelists and many others are working on to ensure this issue continues to move forward, and that we are pushing these extremists out of the mainstream back underground, where they belong.
Thank you all so much. Thank you again for joining us. I'll tell you who our panel guests are one more time. We have Joanna Mendelson, the Associate Director at the Center on Extremism at the Anti-Defamation League. Thank you so much, Joanna.
Yeah.
We have Amy Spitalnick, Executive Director of Integrity First for America. Thank you, Amy. Eric K. Ward is the Executive Director at the Western State Center and the Senior Fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Thank you so much, Eric. And thank you all to our audience for joining us. My name is Molly Boigon. I'm a reporter with The Forward. We have lots of other wonderful events coming up this month and in the months following. I will put the events page link in the chat. And our next event is on February 16th. It's the latest iteration of our Meet the Forward 50, featuring Rabbi Michael Beals, Mayan Zeke, Rabbi B'nai Lapp, and Deborah Kornavaka. I should have put my glasses on before the panel. Thank you again all for joining us and for your work, and hope to see you at the next panel.
Thank you so much.